She stood in front of the mirror, tugging gently at the waistband of her pants. They used to fit perfectly. Now, even the most forgiving elastic felt like it was holding a secret she couldn't quite unravel. Helen wasn't overeating. In fact, since turning 60, her portions had shrunk. She walked daily. She skipped dessert. And still, her belly grew softer, her arms heavier. "How can I be doing everything right and still gaining weight?" she whispered to herself. This is a question many silently carry, too embarrassed to ask out loud. There's an unspoken pressure to accept that weight gain is just part of aging, but that's only part of the story. The truth is more nuanced and more emotional than most doctors have time to explain. By 60, the body begins to change in ways that go far beyond calories in, calories out. Muscle mass naturally declines, especially in women, which means even if you're eating less, your metabolism is burning slower. Add to that hormonal shifts, especially the drop in estrogen, and fat tends to redistribute toward the abdomen. But here's where it gets more subtle. It's not just biology. It's emotional chemistry, too. Helen's days were quiet. Her children lived far away. Her house echoed in the evenings. Meals were simple, eaten in silence. There was no one to share wine with, no one to surprise her with a hand on her shoulder or a joke that made her laugh without thinking. And in that silence, something inside her was also slowing down. Not just metabolism, but aliveness. She noticed she snacked more when she felt lonely. Not out of hunger, but for the comfort of chewing, tasting, filling a space. She realized she'd begun to avoid mirrors, to undress quickly under the covers, to choose comfort clothes over anything that reminded her of the woman she used to be. There was no dramatic moment, no trauma. Just a quiet erosion of spark, one that settled gently but persistently into her body. Science backs what Helen was living. Chronic low-grade loneliness can increase cortisol, the stress hormone, which encourages fat storage, especially visceral fat, the kind that surrounds your organs and is harder to lose. Cortisol also interferes with insulin, making your body more prone to storing rather than burning fat. And emotional numbness, especially when intimacy or affection has faded from daily life, subtly shifts the brain's chemistry in a way that impacts weight. But nobody talks about that in weight loss plans. The focus is always on food and movement, rarely on touch, rarely on connection, rarely on what the body misses when it stops being held, desired, or even gently seen. Helen didn't know it yet, but what her body was asking for wasn't another diet. It was something far more human, something she hadn't realized she was starving for. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Helen was sipping tea at her friend Margaret's kitchen table, both women dancing around the usual topics: aches, grandkids, the absurd price of produce. But then, between sips and sighs, Margaret leaned in and said almost shyly, "You know what I miss the most? Being touched, not just sex, but, being held." Helen blinked. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't thought about that. At first, she laughed it off. "At our age," she said, half joking, half defensive. But later that night, alone in her bed, Margaret's words circled back like a whisper. When was the last time someone had touched her with affection? When was the last time her skin felt wanted, not just for help with the groceries or a doctor's exam, but truly, intimately? It was a startling realization, and with it came something else. A pang of grief. She hadn't just lost youth or a certain shape. She had lost a part of herself, the part that felt radiant, desirable, feminine. Not because someone said so, but because she felt so. That kind of energy, she realized, had slowly faded from her life without a single goodbye. She began noticing things, the way she flinched when someone brushed past her, how she avoided long hugs. The fact that she'd begun referring to her body in third person as something to manage or fight against rather than live in. Her body had become a project, not a home. The next week, she looked at her reflection more closely, not with criticism, but with curiosity. There were lines she'd never noticed, softness in places that once felt firm, but also a glint in her eye that hadn't disappeared, only dimmed. Could there be something in her still waiting to wake up? Helen didn't feel ready to jump into anything physical, but she did feel ready to explore, and the first step wasn't about another exercise plan. It was about reconnecting with the part of her that longed to feel alive, not just functional. That longing wasn't about youth. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about intimacy, not just with someone else, but with herself. Touch, desire, and sensual presence weren't relics of a past life. They were languages her body still remembered. She just hadn't spoken them in a while. And with that subtle shift, a spark lit. Her body wasn't just a vessel of struggle, it was a source of pleasure, too. She had ignored that truth for years. But now something was stirring, and it was more powerful than any diet had ever made her feel. Helen started noticing something strange. Her mood would dip for no reason. She wasn't sad, exactly. Just flat. As if her body had turned the volume down on joy, desire, energy. And with it, the scale crept up again. Not dramatically, just enough to remind her something still wasn't shifting. She kept thinking back to a question that wouldn't leave her alone. Could the absence of touch really be affecting my weight? It sounded almost silly at first, but the more she read, the more it made sense. When we talk about weight loss, most people obsess over food and movement, but very few ever talk about what happens when a body goes untouched for too long. And yet, your hormones are listening. Always. Oxytocin, for example, is known as the love hormone. It's released during affection, intimacy, even simple eye contact or gentle touch. Oxytocin calms the nervous system, lowers stress, and helps regulate appetite. Without it, your body produces more cortisol, the stress hormone, which is directly linked to stubborn belly fat and increased sugar cravings. What's more, chronic touch deprivation has been shown to heighten feelings of anxiety, raise blood pressure, and interfere with sleep quality. And poor sleep. That's one of the fastest ways to slow metabolism and increase fat storage. Helen had spent the last decade prioritizing discipline. She ate right, walked daily, counted her steps, drank her water. But her body still carried a quiet tension, a background hum of unmet emotional need. That tension wasn't burned off by movement. It was held, stored, often in the very places she wanted to change most. She remembered how different she used to feel when she was in love, how even a glance could make her feel lit from within. Back then, she didn't obsess over her weight. She was too busy feeling vibrant, wanted, connected. And maybe, just maybe, it was that connection, not the youth, that helped her body stay light. This wasn't about sex alone. It was about the full chemistry of affection, being seen, being touched, feeling safe enough to exhale fully. Those things aren't luxuries. They are biological needs, especially as we age. Helen began experimenting gently. She held her own hands longer, took time moisturizing her arms with care instead of rushing through. When friends hugged her, she leaned in a second longer. It wasn't always easy, but slowly, something in her body began to soften, not in size, but in resistance. She wasn't just managing her weight anymore. She was tending to the very hormones that regulate it. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to gain weight when they feel isolated? Tell me in the comments if this resonates. Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. Helen stood in the shower one morning, letting the warm water run down her back. She lingered there longer than usual, not out of luxury, but because something inside her was stirring. A thought, a memory. A question she hadn't dared to ask in years. Is it too late for me to feel that again? For the longest time, Helen believed that chapter had closed. Not just sex, but desire itself. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that the world around her had gone quiet on the subject. No one asked. No one looked. And so, slowly, she stopped looking too. She wore the same soft clothes, not because she loved them, but because they helped her disappear. She avoided mirrors. She stopped buying perfume. Even her laughter had become more reserved, measured. Somewhere along the way, she had started treating her body like it was on borrowed time, as if pleasure belonged only to the young. But there, in the quiet warmth of the water, something pushed through. A memory of how it felt to be kissed deeply, the tingle in her stomach, the weightlessness of being touched with tenderness, the way her body used to hum with anticipation, aliveness. And then, just as quickly, a wave of shame. Who was she to want that now? At her age? With her body? This is the invisible grief so many carry. The idea that aging must mean detachment from sensuality. That after 60, desire becomes a punchline, or worse, a source of embarrassment. But that's a lie. And Helen was starting to see it. She didn't want fireworks or grand romance. She wanted to feel in her body again, to feel the heat of skin on skin, to remember that her body wasn't just functional, but beautiful, expressive, deserving. The irony, of course, is that denying this part of herself hadn't made her stronger. It had made her heavier, not just in pounds, but in spirit. The suppression of sensuality had weighed on her more than any meal ever could. She wasn't broken. She wasn't done. She was simply starved for closeness, for expression, for the kind of touch that says, I see you. I want you. You're still here. That day, Helen didn't resolve to get back out there. She didn't sign up for a dating app or throw herself into anything she wasn't ready for. She simply began asking different questions, not about weight or discipline, but about what it would mean to feel like a woman again. Not a patient, not a grandmother, not a person managing her decline, a woman with hunger, with softness, with fire, and for the first time in years, the idea of shedding weight didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a return. The word itself, sex, still made Helen flinch a little. Not because she was ashamed, but because it felt like a language she hadn't spoken in so long, she wasn't sure she'd remember how. In her mind, sex had always been something fast, physical, and youth-driven, something tied to confidence, energy, smooth skin, and tight jeans. That version had long faded, but something else was beginning to take shape. It started with a conversation, not about bodies or positions or fantasies, but about connection. She had reconnected with an old friend, Michael, someone who knew her from a different time. They began talking more often, sharing stories, checking in. And one evening, when he reached out to touch her hand across the table, she didn't pull away. She leaned in. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was tender, quiet. And in that silence, her body responded, not with fear, but with a kind of remembering. Helen had spent years equating sex with performance. Was she attractive enough? Was she doing it right? But with Michael, there was no performance, just presence. And that changed everything. They didn't rush. There was no urgency, no checklist. There were long glances, shared laughter, and the subtle thrill of being seen again, not as a role, but as a woman. And when their intimacy deepened, it wasn't fireworks. It was warmth. It was breath. It was the rediscovery of how good it feels to be fully accepted. She realized that what she had once called sex was just a narrow slice of what it could be. At this stage of life, sex wasn't about agility or novelty. It was about safety, attention, curiosity. It was about the deep exhale that comes from being touched without expectation, from being held without judgment. And something incredible happened. Her body began to respond, not just in bed, but in everyday life. She stood taller. Her skin glowed. Her appetite changed. She slept better. The scale began to budge, not from control, but from calm. Science has a name for this: oxytocin. This hormone, released during affectionate touch and intimacy, reduces cortisol, improves metabolism, and enhances emotional resilience. But Helen didn't need research to tell her that. She felt it, in her bones, in her breath. For the first time in decades, sex wasn't about approval or performance. It was about being present in her own skin, feeling worthy, wanted, alive. She wasn't chasing youth. She was reclaiming something more powerful: her own rhythm, her own voice, her own body, no longer a stranger. And perhaps most healing of all, there was no goal, no outcome to prove, just this moment, this connection, this quiet yes to life, pulsing again beneath her skin. Helen wasn't trying to lose weight anymore, not in the desperate, punishing way she once had. And yet, without tracking calories or increasing her workouts, her clothes began to fit differently. Her energy was steadier, her cravings softened. Something was shifting from the inside out. What changed wasn't just emotional, it was chemical. For years, Helen had thought about weight loss through a mechanical lens. Eat less, move more. But that approach ignored something critical: the body's emotional biochemistry. Hormones don't just react to food and exercise, they respond to love, connection, pleasure. And when those are missing, the body notices. Oxytocin, the so-called cuddle hormone, is a key player here. Released through touch, affection, eye contact, and yes, orgasm, oxytocin does far more than create warm feelings. It actually modulates the entire stress system. In Helen's case, her reawakening of intimacy wasn't just satisfying, it was therapeutic. The oxytocin surge from even simple acts, like holding hands or prolonged hugs, lowered her cortisol levels. That meant less stress-induced fat storage, especially around her midsection. It also improved her insulin sensitivity, reducing the likelihood of storing excess glucose as fat. But there was more. Intimacy improved her sleep, and sleep is where the body repairs, rebalances, and burns fat most efficiently. Helen had spent years waking up at 3 a.m., mind racing. Now she slept deeper, longer. Her body was finally getting the rest it needed to reset its natural rhythm. Her appetite shifted too, not out of willpower, but because her cravings were no longer driven by emotional hunger. When you're starved for affection, the brain seeks other ways to feel good. Food is often the quickest fix. But when that need is met through closeness, laughter, touch, food returns to its rightful place: nourishment, not comfort. Even Helen's posture changed. With emotional safety and renewed confidence, her shoulders relaxed, her chest opened, her breath deepened. Movement felt more natural, not like punishment, but expression. She began dancing again, not for exercise, but for joy. What most weight loss programs miss is this: the body cannot heal under chronic stress, and it cannot relax into health if it feels unloved or unseen. Intimacy is not a bonus in aging. It's a biological ally. It helps regulate the very systems that govern weight, mood, and longevity. Helen didn't need to be in love to feel this. She needed to feel connected to herself, to someone else, to her own pulse of vitality. That connection wasn't something she earned through change. It was something she reclaimed through presence. And the result? Not just weight loss, lightness in her body, her heart, and her life. Helen had always thought pleasure came in big moments: romantic nights, passionate kisses, candle-lit dinners. But those moments felt far away now, like scenes from someone else's story. What she hadn't expected was how much healing could happen in the smallest acts. One morning, she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair slowly, deliberately. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She noticed the curve of her neck, the warmth of her skin, the softness around her eyes. There was beauty there, quiet, unfiltered, real. She began weaving pleasure back into her days in simple ways, rubbing lotion into her arms with care, playing music while she cooked, wearing a silky blouse just for herself. Pleasure, she realized, wasn't something you had to earn or wait for. It could be invited gently into the ordinary. Even laughter became a kind of intimacy. Michael would tease her softly, and she'd find herself laughing with her whole chest, unguarded, present. That laughter, too, had a weight-lifting quality. It reminded her she was still in here, still capable of joy, still allowed to feel good in her own skin. They started taking walks together, not for fitness, but for presence, holding hands, pointing out birds, remembering what it felt like to notice life rather than rush through it. She found herself pausing more, listening more, feeling more. This kind of pleasure had nothing to do with performance. It wasn't about seduction or proving anything. It was about receiving, letting herself be filled with warmth, ease, appreciation, things she had long postponed in the name of responsibility, aging, or fear. Her body began to respond in kind. Her digestion improved. Her joints ached less. Her breath moved freely. She wasn't fighting herself anymore. She was living with herself, in companionship, not conflict. And the weight, it became less of a battle, more of a reflection. Her body was shedding layers, not just of fat, but of pressure, of self-judgment, of the belief that she needed to earn rest or deserve pleasure. Helen realized something profound. Pleasure wasn't the opposite of discipline. It was the missing ingredient. A regulated, calm, and nourished body doesn't hold on to excess. It trusts. It lets go. She hadn't reached this place through a plan. She had followed something quieter, the hum of what felt good, honest, and alive. And she found that when you let your body feel safe again, it softens. It opens. It heals. It wasn't about the bedroom anymore. It was about the invitation to feel, in every small moment, in every inch of skin, in every deep breath that says, I'm still here. Helen didn't talk about it often, not even to herself. But there was a part of her that still carried weight far heavier than pounds. It lived in her chest, tight and quiet. It showed up in old photos she couldn't bear to look at, in memories of a marriage that ended not with a bang, but with a slow unraveling of closeness. In the years she spent caring for everyone else, quietly shelving her own needs. This emotional weight wasn't loud. It was patient. It waited in the background while she tried new diets, walked miles, counted steps. But no matter what she did, there it remained, a subtle tension in her stomach, a dull ache behind her ribs, a sense that her body was holding on to something it didn't know how to release. And now, even as she was rediscovering touch, connection, presence, this weight still lingered. Helen began to understand. Physical weight is often only the most visible symptom of something deeper. Her body hadn't just stored fat. It had stored moments of abandonment, of rejection, of trying to be strong when all she wanted was to be held. Every time she pushed her feelings aside, her body absorbed the residue. Every time she told herself, it doesn't matter, her nervous system took note. She wasn't just living in a body that had changed. She was living in a body that remembered. That's when she began writing. Not grand declarations, just short reflections. She wrote about the time her partner stopped touching her, the day she realized her children didn't call as often anymore, the night she cried in the dark and told no one. As she wrote, she wept. And as she wept, something shifted. She began seeing her extra weight not as failure, but as a form of loyalty. Her body had protected her, had held her grief when no one else did, had kept her grounded through years of emotional drought. It hadn't betrayed her. It had carried her, but it was tired. And now it was safe enough to let go. She started having conversations she'd avoided for years. With her children, with herself. She allowed herself to miss what had been lost. And slowly, her body responded, not by shrinking, but by softening. The tightness around her belly eased. Her jaw unclenched. Her breath deepened. The emotional block wasn't just sadness, it was fear. Fear that if she let herself feel fully, she would be overwhelmed. But the truth was the opposite. In feeling, she found freedom. And in that freedom, she discovered something far more powerful than discipline or willpower. She discovered release. Not everyone has someone to hold their hand across the table. And Helen knew that well. There were many nights when Michael wasn't around, when the house was silent again, when the warmth she'd tasted felt like a fading echo. She remembered those long stretches before they reconnected, when loneliness felt like a second skin, and yet something had changed. Not because someone else had entered her life, but because she had started treating herself differently. Helen realized that waiting for intimacy from someone else had kept her in a state of quiet longing. What if, she wondered, the intimacy could start with her? At first it felt strange, lighting candles just for herself, playing music in the evening with no one to impress, putting on a soft nightgown not for anyone's gaze, but her own comfort. But little by little, these small acts built something powerful, a return of sensual presence. She began to explore touch again, not sexually but tenderly, moisturizing slowly, resting her hand on her chest and breathing deeply, letting her fingers trace her skin with intention, not to fix or judge, but simply to feel. And in those moments, something sacred stirred. She wasn't trying to replace a partner, she was rebuilding a bridge to herself. Research shows that self-touch, mindful breath work, and even mirror gazing can stimulate oxytocin release and calm the nervous system. Just like affectionate touch from another, the body doesn't discriminate between external and internal compassion. It simply responds to care. Helen also started exploring sensual movement, not exercise, movement. She would sway slowly to music in her living room, barefoot, eyes closed, remembering the rhythms that lived in her hips, her shoulders, her spine. At first, it felt awkward, then liberating. She even began whispering words of affirmation aloud, at first with hesitation, then with clarity. "You're beautiful. You're still here. You deserve softness." There were tears. There was laughter. There was a reawakening. This solo intimacy didn't replace connection with others, but it prepared her for it. It reminded her of her worth, her capacity, her fire. It was a practice of remembrance, not of who she used to be, but of who she had always been. Pleasure, it turns out, isn't something others give us. It's something we allow ourselves to feel. Have you ever created a moment of intimacy just for yourself? A bath, a dance, a quiet meal with candles? Share your rituals in the comments. Someone else might be needing your idea right now. Helen stood at the window one evening, the sky fading into that soft indigo before night. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because the fabric felt like a gentle hug. She smiled to herself, not a big smile, but the kind that comes when the body is finally at peace. She hadn't counted a single calorie in months. She hadn't punished herself on the treadmill or sworn off bread. And yet her jeans fit better. Her joints ached less. Her reflection no longer startled her. It welcomed her. What had changed wasn't her willpower. It was her relationship with her own body. She had reintroduced something the health world rarely acknowledges as essential: intimacy. Not just physical, but emotional. A closeness with herself, a tenderness with her desires, a willingness to feel, not numb, not fix, not control, but truly feel. That intimacy had real measurable effects. Her cravings decreased because she no longer used food to soothe a distant ache. Her energy returned because her body wasn't in a constant state of stress or suppression. Her skin glowed because sleep came easier, her hormones were settling, and her breath no longer lived in her chest. It had returned to her belly. She didn't feel young again. She felt fully here. And the most profound discovery? She no longer feared the scale because her body was no longer a battleground. It had become a partner, a guide, a home. This wasn't about sex alone. It was about saying yes to life in all its textures, laughing without shrinking, crying without shame, touching without guilt, and most of all, living with a body that is felt, not just managed. Helen's journey wasn't miraculous. It was human. She didn't chase a fantasy. She listened to her truth, and that truth carried her back to herself. The missing link to weight loss after 60 wasn't in the gym or on a plate. It was in her skin, her heart, her breath, her willingness to invite pleasure back into her days, not as reward, but as right. Which part of Helen's story felt most familiar to you? Was it the silence, the longing, the surprise of rediscovery? Share with me in the comments. I read everyone, and maybe, just maybe, your words will help someone else find their way home too.